Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and it's already part 5 of my Kobolds and Catacombs card review, and this time around I have 6 new cards, including some pretty interesting class cards that could certainly shake things up. As always is the case with my reviews, I will be doing some detailed reviews up front, but if you're somebody who's short on time and just wants to see the cards, there's a handy link in the description that will take you to my quick reviews at the end, which will just rapid fire through each of the cards, show you what they are, and give you my 1 to 5 star rating to save you some time. But if you're somebody that wants to stick around and hear me ramble for the next 30 minutes or so, welcome to the detailed reviews. Up first, we have a new Paladin weapon. This is the Unidentified Maul, and this follows the pattern we saw previously with the Unidentified Elixir for Priest, but instead of being a spell this time around, it's a weapon, a 3-mana 2/2 by default, and then whenever you draw this card, it will pop up and it will gain a random bonus effect, much like we saw previously with the Unidentified Elixir, and there are 4 potential bonus effects here for the Unidentified Maul, which are the following. You can give your minions Divine Shield. You can give your minions +1 attack. You can give your minions Taunt. And then finally, you can summon 2 1/1 Silver Hand Recruits. So basically 3 out of 4 of these are really rather powerful plays, that being Divine Shield, +1 attack, and Silver Hand Recruits. I do not think giving your minions Taunt is going to be nearly so important for the kinds of people who want to run this card. Because if you look at this card, it really to me feels more like an aggro card versus a control card. Because most of these conditions do require you to already have minions on the board. Now, Paladin clearly always has their hero power to play a minion on 2, but it's not likely to survive going into your turn 3 because it only has 1 health. So a deck that is more focused on wide boards with lots of small things and resilient things at that seems like it's going to synergize much better with a majority of the options of Blessed Maul. So that is the first kind of point of note. I don't think this works nearly as well in a control deck. As far as just a raw stat line is concerned, I think some people will be a little worried about the 2/2 because it's not a 3/2, and often 3 is much better than 2 because a lot of things have 3 health. That's a little concerning to me as well. That's another kind of mark against this card, although we have seen things like Jade Claws pretty successfully played in Shaman for a long time. And if you compare, for instance, Champion's Maul down there on the right to Jade Claws, especially in the early game, 2 1/1s is much better than Jade Claws, which usually only gets you 1 1/1. The slight downside is that this does take the full 3 mana to play. You can't kind of cheat it out early with Overload, so that's 1 turn later where things tend to get more and more health. So I don't know that Jade Claws is a direct comparison because you can't coin this out on 1, you can't even play it freely on 2. So you're basically risking giving your opponent more and more time to either buff those small things if they're like a token deck, or just play more things that are more important. Like, does the Murloc War Leader already come down? Now I can't answer a Murloc War Leader very efficiently. So essentially what I'm getting at with all these sort of different concerns I've addressed so far is that it feels to me like Unidentified Maul might just have too many things that have to line up for this to be a good card. Now, clearly, if you're like in a Murloc deck and you've managed to get out like 3 Murlocs and you play Blessed Maul on turn 3 and it gives them all +1 attack or gives them all Divine Shield, that's incredibly good. Like, that's exactly what an aggro deck wants to do. Have some sort of card that follows up an early board swarm that allows you to go 2 for 1 against your opponent's minions so they can't quite keep up. It helps you push through taunts. All of those things are great, clearly. But the times it doesn't work is what really makes me nervous about this card. Because consistency is important, having something that's reliable is important. And for instance, if you draw and it just gives your minions Taunt a quarter of the time, I think that's going to be really disappointing, especially if you're an aggro deck. So it feels to me like there's some potential here. Clearly they've gotten some things right. Like, a lot of it lines up. Divine Shield is really powerful. +1 attack could be insanely good. Summoning a couple dudes, it makes it sort of a mini muster for battle, which was a cool card as well. A very powerful card historically in Paladin. So I'm essentially torn. Do I focus on the upside? Do I focus on the downside? To me, in that balancing act, the downsides weigh out a little higher for Unidentified Maul. So I think I have to give this one a little weaker score and essentially say that although it has some potential, I think most of the time, the fact that it's unidentified, the fact that it's inconsistent, the fact that it doesn't have 3 attack, all of those mean that it's a playable card, probably, but on the weaker side of playable cards, certainly not on the stronger side of them. So now let's move on to another class card. This time around, it's a new mage minion, the Raven Familiar. This is a 2-mana 2/2 beast with a battle cry, reveal a spell in each deck, and if yours costs more, then you draw it. So this is essentially another little 2-mana pull a specific kind of card out of your deck. And I say specific kind of card for a reason here. We've seen Arcanologist in the past, which pulled only secrets. And Raven Familiar really theoretically pulls only expensive spells, right? Because most decks are going to have cheap spells. So for this to hit consistently and reliably, it's going to have to be on higher cost things. Things like Arcane Intellect and Frostbolt are going to make Raven Familiar very, very unlikely to actually draw a card if those are in your deck. So essentially, Raven Familiar, I think, follows a pattern of cards, and we're actually going to see another one on this in this review down the road a little bit, which are encouraging you to build your deck in specific kinds of ways and encouraging you to do things to support cards like this. Because, for instance, if Raven Familiar draws a Firelands Portal, that's good. Firelands Portal is a good card. You're going to be drawing a great card into your deck, or excuse me, into your hand, which is really powerful. And there's also the upside here for Raven Familiar that it reveals a spell in your opponent's deck. And that can give you a huge advantage. Like if this were to become popular in a mage deck and everybody knows you always run Firelands Portal and control mage, that's not revealing anything to your opponent. But if you're seeing, okay, they actually run Spike Ridge Steed, that's important to know. I need to play around that. That could be really valuable. The downsides essentially, or the risks with Raven Familiar, are that it doesn't draw you a card sometimes, and if it doesn't draw you a card sometimes, that makes it a really, really bad 2-mana play compared to something like Arcanologist, which is guaranteed to draw you a card and thin out your deck and make it more likely you draw better cards later. Raven Familiar risks that because he could just whiff completely. It's a 2/2, which is not as good as something like a 2/3 for Arcanologist. It just doesn't trade as well into early boards from aggressive decks, so that makes it riskier in things like Control Mage that really do need to ensure that they can stay alive until they get to those expensive kinds of cards. And of course, to play Raven Familiar successfully, I think you just have to cut too many good, low-cost mage spells to make it work. You have to throw out the Arcane Intellects and the Frostbolts and the Primordial Glyphs of the world, all of which have seen a lot of success in Mage. I just don't think this one's good enough if you're also running, 6 really cheap spells that are very likely to make this card whiff. So I think there's just too much compromise required for Raven Familiar, at least as we understand Mage and as we understand Hearthstone right now. One potential out for this card is like maybe you play it in an aggro deck and you just have a Pyroblast and you use it to draw either your Pyroblast or some other really expensive high-cost thing, maybe even Firelands Portal. Like you just run Firelands Portal and you play like a minion-based deck on top of that. I don't really think that's the home or the world this card succeeds in because there's some problems there as well. Like drawing a Pyroblast that early in the game just doesn't do much. It just kind of sits there. You'd probably just rather have an aggressive minion on the board that attacks for more or threatens the board or does something more impactful like Sorcerer's Apprentice, for instance, would be a much better 2-drop in that scenario. So to me, Raven Familiar just doesn't look like it has a home. Now, clearly, when it works, it would be amazing. So there's always potential for cards like this, because if somebody finds the exact right mix of cards or the right kind of meta where there just aren't very many expensive spells out there, this card could pop up from time to time, but I think most of the other times this card just looks like a failure that requires you to do a little bit too much to make it succeed. So now let's move on to a new Hunter minion. This is the Seeping Oozeling, a 6-mana 5/4 with a battle cry that reads, gain the death rattle of a random minion in your deck. Yet another card that's all about manipulating your deck in specific ways to make otherwise weak cards look really, really strong. And this time around, I'm not quite sure it's going to work either. It's another one of those deck building challenges. Somebody could solve the puzzle for Seeping Oozeling and make this a really cool card. It has potential. I mean, even looking at things like the new Hunter Legendary Katharina, who recruits a beast from your deck, that's a really powerful death rattle, potentially, if you only run great beasts in your deck. So I do think there's some world in a slower kind of control Hunter deck where Seeping Oozeling and Savannah Highmane and Katharina Winterwisp are all run together so that you only have a pool of really powerful death rattles, and you potentially just high roll into crazy kinds of plays, sort of a big Hunter in some ways almost. That kind of environment supports Seeping Oozeling really well. Outside of that specific kind of deck, just in like a normal mid-range hunter deck, Seeping Oozeling looks pretty bad, right? Because most of the death rattles that are in just a mid-range hunter deck would make this card distinctly worse than its brother, Savannah Highmane, right? Because it's a 6-mana 5/4, even if it gains Savannah Highmane's Death Rattle, which is probably one of the better Death Rattles in a normal mid-range hunter deck, then it's just a strictly worse Savannah Highmane. That's the most obvious comparison. And there are other weaker Death Rattles too. Think of things like Kindly Grandmother. 5/4 that summoned a 3/2 is just a weaker version of Savannah Highmane again. And of course, it's also 6 mana, so you only have a limited ability to run so many cards at a certain cost without completely disrupting a deck's curve. Especially in something like mid-range hunter, it's very specific in how it curves out because it needs to do things very consistently in the early to mid games to succeed, and then top off with these really powerful 6-drops. But if you got dead 6-drops in your hand because you're running like 4 or 5 6-drops, that's really punishing. So even though this card synergizes really wisely with Savannah Highmane, it's probably going to be hard to run alongside Savannah Highmane, unless, of course, you reshape the deck into that kind of Katharina Winterwisp, later, more control-style hunter deck. So I do think there's a potential for Seeping Oozeling to succeed if that sort of deck list, as we can see it forming right now in the new Catacombs, Kobolds and Catacombs meta, if that's possible, Seeping Oozeling could in fact work. There are clearly some great death rattles. You can also think about things like eggs, for instance. You could pop in some Devilsaur eggs in Hunter, and now this is a 5/4 that summons a 5/5. And that's a pretty good 6-drop, right? So if you're manipulating your deck, if you're massaging your deck list into something that supports Seeping Oozeling, I like this card. If you're not, this is not a card you just dump in to any given mid-range hunter list and hope it works. So basically what I'm saying, what this all boils down to is that it could be good and it could be bad, which to me means right now it's just an average card. And the theme of deck manipulation continues in my next card. This is the Spiteful Summoner. This is a 6-mana 4/4 with a battle cry that reads, reveal a spell from your deck, very similar to our Raven Familiar previously, and except it reveals just a spell in your deck, not your opponent's, which is an important distinction. Summon a random minion with the same cost. So the dream here for Spiteful Summoner, of course, is revealing Ultimate Infestation and then summoning a random 10-drop. Summoning, for instance, Yashiraj. That's a pretty cool play, right? A 6-mana Yashiraj is nuts, especially when you just kind of get a 4/4 for free. That's a really powerful turn. So the downside, of course, is that if your deck also runs Wrath, if you have Wrath and Ultimate Infestation, then you just summon a 2-mana minion. And a 4/4 that summons, a 2/2 is not good enough for 6 mana. It's just not strong enough. Like, yes, technically it's 6/6 in stats on average, but that's not a good play. There are so many better kinds of plays. You're sacrificing too much there. So there's this real kind of question, like, where is that line? Are you able to run Wrath and Spiteful Summoner? Does that make sense? Because it's going to fail sometimes just because occasionally you're going to hit that Yashiraj and it's going to win you games. Like, is the high roll potential good enough to make Spiteful Summoner fit in normal decks? I think the answer to that question is no. But once again, on the same theme, Blizzard clearly is designing in a specific way here. If you can build a deck that only runs Ultimate Infestations, right? If you have just minions and you've only got a really high cost spell, or if you're not Druid, let's say you're Mage and you only run Pyroblast, or maybe you run exactly an 8-mana spell because there's a lot of good 8-mana minions in the game as well. In those scenarios, Spiteful Summoner is probably really good. Like, if you know you're only ever going to get a 10-cost minion or an 8-cost minion, Spiteful Summoner is pretty good. As it creeps down to 7-cost and 6-cost and 5-cost, the more spells in your deck that cost 7 or less mana, this starts to get weaker a lot faster, I think. 7-mana minions really might not be worth it on average. A 4/4 that summons a Baron Geddon, it's like, is that really enough? 6-drops even more so. Like, there's a lot of whiffed 6-drops too. You could always hit some really weak summons as well. It's kind of the same thing as that evolve-devolve balance. There's just some minions that suck at their costs. So I think the risks really start to compile unless you have only 8, 9, or 10 mana spells in your deck. So I think most of the time this card never gets played. I think a vast majority of the time. If somebody builds a specific deck to support it, it's going to be good. It's going to be powerful. But can that deck succeed? Can a Druid succeed without Wrath and only Ultimate Infestation. Can a mage succeed with only Pyroblast and all minions? I doubt it. And then in a scenario that probably would work really well, which is like a minion-based paladin that has all weapons and throws in only Spike Ridge Steeds as its only spell, is a 6-mana minion off Spiteful Summoner good enough? I'm not sure it is. Like, the times you hit Cairn, that'd be pretty exciting, but there's a lot of whiffs for 6 mana as well. And if you're going to pay 6 mana to summon a 6-mana minion, I'm not sure the 4/4 bonus from Spiteful Summoner is enough to make up for all that downside. So to me, this is another card that, you know, it potentially could be amazing in that Ultimate Infestation deck. The rest of the time, I just don't think Spiteful Summoner is going to do the job. It's far too compromising in how you have to support your deck and how you have to build your deck. So I don't really see this one working all that often. Okay, so up next, let's move on to a card that actually stands on its own. And I mean that quite literally. This is the Lone Champion, a 3-mana 2/4 neutral minion with a battle cry that reads, if you control no other minions, gain Taunt and gain Divine Shield. So that's a really, really good card. A 3-mana 2/4 that's taunted and divine shielded is fantastic, right? That's a lot of stats. It's a very highly defensive minion, and of course divine shield can be very, very difficult to deal with sometimes. That is comparable or arguably even better than something like Tar Creeper. But there is that condition, right? If you control no other minions. And that's really, to me, where this card like lives and dies. If you always had a 2/4 with Divine Shield and Taunt, I think you'd probably run it over Tar Creeper in most scenarios because it's more likely to go 2-for-1. It's better on your turn because you can trade it proactively, like Tar Creeper at 1 attack is tough to work with. It's better for things like buffs. It's just a little more versatile than a card like Tar Creeper, if it always worked. Since it doesn't always work, I think Lone Champion is a much, much bigger challenge. A lot of people are talking about how good this card's going to be, but I'm afraid they're not recognizing how often it's just unlikely to succeed. And even when it does succeed, is it going to do enough in that moment? For instance, like a lot of people are saying, control decks would love to run this because in the late game, they're going to be out of minions, and they're going to open their turn with a card like Lone Champion. That's possibly true. Like, there could be a lot of scenarios where this goes off successfully. But to me, if I'm in a late game scenario and my board is empty and I'm trying to defend myself against my opponent, I would still always rather have Stonehill Defender. Because Stonehill Defender is still a taunt that gets in the way, it disrupts their plan, but it gives me a second taunt, and it potentially gives me a really powerful second taunt. So if I'm comparing 3-mana sort of taunt-themed cards, I don't think I ever run Lone Champion over Stonehill Defender, because the potential to just get an additional card, an additional resource, an extra Tyrian Forge Ring, and an extra Obsidian statue from time to time, that's a much, much higher upside in a control deck than a Divine Shield. And of course, Lone Champion doesn't always go off. Sometimes even in control decks, especially in aggro decks, you're likely to have other minions lingering around on the board, and then Lone Champion is just a 3-mana 2/4. And that's really not very powerful at all, right? That's just a below average stat line compared to other 3 drops you could run in your deck. And then Lone Champion feels pretty terrible. So I don't see him working in control decks. As far as aggro decks stand, there is some maybe potential here where it's like, well, I just got wiped out, my opponent cleared my board, I'm going to play Lone Champion. If he goes off again with Divine Shield and Taunt, he would be a really powerful aggro card, particularly in something like a buff deck, maybe like a hand buff Paladin or a buff-based Paladin. You could see Lone Champion making a lot of sense in that environment. Divine Shields on minions and high health on minions can both work really well in aggro decks because they're difficult for your opponent to remove the card, and then they're just additional stats and additional body, just something that's really sticky, protects other higher value resources. So, you know, even like a token druid could perchance love Lone Champion. An aggro paladin could love Lone Champion. But, again, can you sit on a card and wait until your board is empty to play it? Is that really what those decks want to do? No, they want to make sure they play everything, and I don't know that a 2/4 without Divine Shield, without Taunt, is good enough. Like, the risks, once again, seem to outweigh the upside for me when it comes to Lone Champion. Now, all that said, I think this is going to be a pretty great arena card. Like, on turn 3 in arena, you're often at an empty board, or just often there's a lot of scenarios in arena where an empty board is perfect. And this is a hard thing to deal with in arena. You know, it eats 2 Deathwing attacks, essentially. So I think Lone Champion is going to be fantastic in arena. And constructed, I really just don't think this guy is better than the alternatives that currently exist. And unfortunately for Lone Champion, it rotates at the same rate as Stonehill Defender and Tar Creeper do, so it's never going to have time to sort of outshine those competitors. There might be 1 or 2 decks very occasionally that find this as a more successful card than those 2 other alternatives I mentioned, but I really don't see that happening. I think this is just a worse option compared to those. Not a fundamentally bad card by any means. It's got a cool effect. It's got worthwhile stats, just not strong enough in Hearthstone as we see it today. And then finally, I have one last card here. This is another neutral minion. This is the Silver Vanguard, a new 7-mana 3/3 with a Death Rattle that reads, I think I just said Death Cradle instead of Death Rattle. There's been a lot of cards to review, guys. A Death Rattle that reads, recruit an 8-cost minion. So here, essentially, the dream right is Tyrion. Again, it's some really high-value 8-cost cards, of which there are a handful that are played in Hearthstone today. There's a Lich King, of course, everybody can run. So the idea is you play Silver Vanguard on 7, it dies pretty easily because it's only a 3/3, and then you get a free Lich King or a free Tyrion or free whatever else, and then on turn 8 you still have all of that mana. So you get a turn 8 Lich King plus a turn 8 Tyrion, or vice versa. You could do both if your deck had both, right? And you'd probably want to run multiple 8-cost minions to ever make Silver Vanguard succeed. But I feel like I'm beating a dead horse a little bit here. I feel like I'm just on repeat. I've got deja vu. The challenge with Silver Vanguard is that you have to build your deck in a very specific way to support this card. And there's a lot of risk with Silver Vanguard as well, because what happens if you draw Tyrion and you draw the Lich King before you play Silver Vanguard? Then you have a completely useless 3/3 for 7 mana, and that is just unbelievably bad, and there are going to be instances where that happens. And frankly, even if you always get Tyrion or Lich King, this card might still just be too slow. Spending 7 mana to just develop a 3/3 is going to get you killed in Hearthstone all the time. Right now, Bone Mare is the king of turn 7 because Bone Mare does 2 things, right? Bone Mare applies a ton of aggression for faster decks so that they can kill their opponent and just play a ton of stats all at once. And it also plays a taunt. It's a defensive tool in a lot of ways. It helps you stabilize. It helps you force your opponent to trade into your big statted thing instead of just killing you outright. Comparing Silver Vanguard to that, it sacrifices your entire turn 7. You're giving up a ton of stats over any comparable turn 7 play, and you're doing so at some pretty incredible risk. Like, what if they silence your Silver Vanguard? Then you've just played an absolutely awful card. You know, a Savannah Highmane that gets silenced is still a 6/5. A Silver Vanguard that gets silenced is a 7-mana 3/3, and that's god-awful, right? What if you can't kill it the next turn? What if it's like a token deck, or they play a 0/2 taunt because they're a shaman, right? There's scenarios where they might just play a taunt. They might play a Stonehill Defender, and you can't trade in. You can't kill it. Then it's another turn slower. There's so many things that can go wrong between the time you spend this mana and the reward for this mana comes, which is, you know, that Death Rattle actually going off, that I just don't know that it's worth it. And of course, you have to draw a card in between playing this and actually activating the Death Rattle most of the time. So then you might draw your 8-drop that you're looking to get. There's just a lot that can backfire with Silver Vanguard. So I don't like how backloaded the value proposition on this card is, right? It's just, it comes a long way down the line. And even then, it's like you get an 8-drop on turn 8. And of course, you still have 8 mana, so it's like you get kind of an 8 mana bonus in a lot of ways from Silver Vanguard. But that's at a point in the game where your opponent has had so much time to draw into removal, they just slam the Polymorph, they slam the Twisting Nether, and all of that work you've done for that sort of tempo advantage where you just get to deploy that 8 mana for free, I'm not really sure that it's worth it because you've sacrificed so much along the way. Not to mention, of course, you've had a 7-cost card in your hand for most of the game too, which is a lot of risk there because you just got a dead card. It could be something else more active, more threatening, more playable, a lower cost card. So that's a bit more of a deck building challenge, I guess, once again. But to me, I just don't ever see how Silver Vanguard lines up well Like, yes, in the scenarios it works perfectly well. It's a pretty strong play. But those scenarios are so few and far between and so likely to fail that I just don't think anybody's going to find this card worth the challenge or worth the risk. So it's going to fall to the bottom of the pile pretty quickly in Kobolds and Catacombs. And there you go. That was it for my detailed reviews. I think that was enough rambling for now. So what I'd like to do next is jump into my quick star reviews where I'll rate each of these cards from 1 to 5 stars. Unidentified Maul is a 3-star card. Raven Familiar is a 2-star card. Seeping Oozeling is a 2-star card. Spiteful Summoner is a 2-star card. Lone Champion is a 3-star card. And Silver Vanguard is a 1-star card. And there you go, guys. That wraps it up for part 5 of my Kobolds and Catacombs card review. A little bit of a mixed bag there. Some cards I think have a little bit of potential, seem like they do things well enough to find a deck here or there. Some other cards that might just be too risky or too high rolly. But I want to hear what you guys think. Which of these cards do you think might see play? Which ones are terrible? What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Leave all those thoughts in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.